Well, thank you, President Marion and members and guests. It's my great pleasure today to be able to introduce to you Laura Clark, the British High Commissioner. Clark with an E. We have to make sure we get that correct. Laura has had a career in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. She has been posted in Pretoria, and she has worked on issues related to Europe and the Middle East and other parts of the world. Her coming to New Zealand is in some ways a happy occasion because her husband actually is a New Zealander. So there is a degree of family reunion going on as well as a professional posting. We probably have two sorts of heads of mission posted to New Zealand, if I can say this with some care. People who have reached the climax of their career, this is their sort of posting to reward them for having been in Ulaanbaatar or Lagos or somewhere, whatever, and then people who are rising stars. And I think you will appreciate that Laura is probably in the latter category. So please join me in welcoming Laura Clark to speak to us on the UK, New Zealand and the post-Brexit world.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. It's a pleasure to be here and to be speaking to such an illustrious group and quite a few familiar faces around the room. And thank you again, John, for the invitation. It's also an immense privilege to be the British High Commissioner to New Zealand. It has always been a fabulous job, whichever stage of your career you are at. And it's a fabulous job because of the strength of our people-to-people links, the historical ties, the sporting and cultural links, the shared values, the shared humour. But it's a particularly interesting and important job right now, both in terms of UK-New Zealand relations in a Brexit context, but also in a time of major global change. So I'm going to use my time to talk to you a bit about the Brexit negotiations, and of course I'm going to be able to provide total clarity on everything that's happening. I will then try and say a little bit about what it means and what it doesn't mean for the UK in Europe. Then I'll talk about the UK and the world and our global posture, and then perhaps most relevant, the importance of the UK-New Zealand relationship and UK-New Zealand cooperation in that wider Brexit and global context. So, first, and of course the topic that I am asked about most of all, Brexit. Often, I think I might sort of rewind a little bit, and often when I'm explaining where we're at to a New Zealand audience, I talk in terms of sovereignty and sovereignty sacrifice. And I explain it like this. So for most continental Europeans, their decision to join the EEC or the European Union was part of their journey out of conflict or out of totalitarianism. It was part of their democratization process. For the UK, by contrast, when we joined the EEC in 1973, and I'm well aware of the resonance of that here in New Zealand as well, when we joined the EEC in 1973, it was an economic decision. It wasn't an identity decision. It wasn't part of our democratization process in any way. And I say that by way of then explaining, for lots of continental Europeans, being part of the EU, part of this nie wieder, the never again, that is an identity issue. And therefore, the sovereignty sacrifice that comes with being part of the European Union, so for example, not having control of your own borders and immigration policy, not having control of your own trade policy, having the final court of appeal not being in your own country, those things perhaps sat more easily with our continental European friends than they do with many Brits, and that felt, I think that sovereignty sacrifice felt harder for some in the UK than it perhaps does elsewhere. And you know, I often say I'm not sure if New Zealand was asked to make that level of sovereignty sacrifice, to not have its own trade policy, to have its final court of appeal in, I don't know, Apia or Canberra. I'm not sure what you would say to that. So that goes some way to explaining a little bit of the genesis of where we are. Of course, there are lots of other factors. And it, of course, remains a very divisive issue in our country. And it is a very difficult issue and a very difficult one to find a way through. And, you know, that's not surprising. We are negotiating our way through enormous constitutional change, because we've been interwoven essentially with the EU in terms of our economic and legal fabric over these past decades. So there's a lot to be done. But I think the most important thing is that the government is committed to respecting the result of the referendum. In fact, all of Parliament is committed to respecting the result of the referendum, and committed also to a smooth and orderly Brexit. Now, it doesn't always look smooth and orderly. It often looks messy. Our politics is noisy, it's messy, and temperatures run high. But underneath all of that, and underneath all the reporting, I think it's important to remember that significant progress has been made. So since Article 50 was triggered in March 2017, the negotiations have been in train, a few landmarks. So in March 2018, we agreed on an implementation period, which would run from Brexit Day, which will be end of March, through till December 2020. We've agreed an approximate bill, or sort of divorce bill, I suppose you can call it, of approximately 40 billion. We've reached agreement on the rights of EU nationals, and I think there's a lot there. And in 14th of November last year, as you probably know, we reached agreement with the EU on the terms of our withdrawal, on the draft withdrawal agreement, and then, of course, the draft outline political statement, which set out in broad terms our shared aspiration for the future relationship. But that withdrawal agreement, of course, was rejected, was voted down in Parliament. And so I'm going to unpack that a little bit, and I suppose what that means is the overall withdrawal agreement, it was voted down, but it was clear from that and from subsequent votes that the majority of MPs would support a deal along those lines, but with changes to the famous backstop. Now, I'll take a bit of time just to explain the backdrop. So essentially, the withdrawal agreement and the planning that we've done so far allows for an implementation period that will start once we Brexit, end of March this year, and it will run through till December 2020. Now, what's important about that implementation period is it allows for significant continuity. So continued membership of the common market, continued membership of the customs union, continued application of the ECJ. All that is meant to mean continuity, confidence, enough time and space for us to be planning for the next stage. Interestingly, almost the most significant departure from the status quo in the implementation period is that we have the right to negotiate and sign trade agreements with other countries, which is quite significant in the New Zealand context. But as part of that withdrawal agreement and part of the plan for the implementation period is a backstop, which is essentially how we avoid, if in that period of the implementation period we are not able to find a way of avoiding a hard border with Ireland, then the backstop comes into play and the UK remains part of the customs union until we can do so. And that, of course, has been the source of a lot of upset across the political spectrum in the UK, and so that is what our Prime Minister and ministers are now trying to resolve in negotiations in Brussels, which is how to achieve changes to the backstop in a way that will gain support of our political parties. And there should be a parliamentary vote on this by the 27th of February. So we're still in a period of negotiation. And, of course, the clock is ticking. And so while I think as I say, the government is fully committed to a smooth and orderly exit, and while we think it highly likely that we will find a way through, we still need to think now, and we still need to plan and are planning on a contingency basis for the risk that we have a no-deal Brexit. And so there's a lot of work going on about how we maintain regulatory continuity, and in particular to ensure the free flow of goods, services and people. And of course there's a big New Zealand angle there. So that's probably a bit enough detail on the backstop. I don't know how much you want on a Monday lunchtime. But I'll sort of zoom out again now and talk a little bit more about the EU. And you know, this is a momentous time in our relationship with our European partners. And the negotiations get tense. And of course, nothing is agreed until everything's agreed. But I think what's really important here, and what I always say, it's so important to reiterate that our European partners are our closest allies and neighbours. We're incredibly closely aligned, not just economically, but on our core values, how we see the world, respect for democracy, rule of law, climate change, the importance of the rules-based international order. The list goes on. And so it's really clear and needs to always be held in the forefront that while we're leaving the EU, we're not leaving Europe. And as our Prime Minister said last year, we should not think of our leaving the EU as marking an ending, as much as a new beginning for the United Kingdom and our relationship with our European allies. She's also been clear, and I quote, that Europe's security is our security, the United Kingdom is unconditionally committed to maintaining it. And in fact, just 2 days ago, C, the wonderfully named C, the chief of our intelligence agencies, Alex Younger, at the Munich Security Conference, said, Britain's commitment to the security of the European continent is unconditional. We will not only retain the cooperation we have built, but go further. So, although it's bumpy, and although all these debates, particularly in our Parliament, take up a lot of time and oxygen, I am confident, and I would say my government is confident, that we will come to an agreement that is based on our shared values, it's based on those commitments, and we will find an agreement that works not just for our economies, but for our security and for our people too, because frankly there's too much at stake for it not to work. So that's probably enough on the detail of Brexit, and of course, you know, for me, the joy of this job is that I'm not involved in the negotiations on a day-to-day, and lots of my job is the what next, the so what does that mean for Britain in the rest of the world, what does it mean for Britain in the Pacific, what does it mean for UK-New Zealand relations. So let me talk a bit about that, about Britain on the global stage and our position, our ambition, our values. Because many after the referendum took that as some sort of sign that the UK was turning in on itself. In fact, the opposite is the case. And in a way, the vote on Brexit was not so much a vote against the EU, it was a vote for sovereignty. It was also a vote for those other relationships that perhaps we had not been investing in as much as we could have done. The UK is one of the few countries in the world to spend 0.7% of GDP on aid and 2% on defence. We're the world's 5th biggest economy. We're committed to our membership of NATO, our seat at the UN Security Council, the G7, the G20, and our leading role at the moment in the Commonwealth as current chair in office. Our foreign policy is predicated on our values: democratisation, multilateralism, the rule of law and human rights. We're committed to protecting the environment, taking urgent action to tackle climate change, promoting equal education globally. We're committed to upholding and reforming, crucially, the international rules-based order to ensure it's fit for purpose, and to protect and preserve global norms such as, for example, the norm against the use of chemical weapons, which we collectively underlined last year at meetings of the parties to the Chemical Weapons Convention, meetings convened by the UK but very vigorously supported by New Zealand. We also, like New Zealand, see free trade as a global good, not just in economic terms, but it also enhances bilateral relations and ensures a level of cooperation and interdependence that reduces the risk of conflict. So when we leave the EU, we will become once again a fully independent member of the WTO, championing free trade and campaigning and pushing for a more effective, for a reformed and more effective WTO. And you may have noticed that we're also looking at plurilateral trade, and we have been consulting on potential UK accession to the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP, one of the least elegant acronyms so far, I think. And we never stand still, because if you stand still, of course, in this world, you're going backwards. And there are very important changes in this part of the world, in Oceania and the Pacific. We're increasing our presence in the Pacific and opening 3 new high commissions in Tonga, Vanuatu, and Samoa. But for me personally, that's a shame, because I'm currently High Commissioner to Samoa, and I will be sad to hand over that responsibility. But it's the right thing to do, and I advocated for it very strongly in the UK. And it is motivated by a few things, by a recognition that perhaps we withdrew a bit too much from the Pacific in the early 2000s, and we've not been present enough, by a shared commitment to tackling climate change and protecting our oceans, and our Pacific Island partners are on the front line in that respect, and also a response to the desire from Australia and New Zealand for us to be more involved and to engage more closely in that region. So, what about the UK and New Zealand in all of this? Well, first, in a Brexit context, I think it's important to say, for the avoidance of doubt, that we fully support New Zealand's strong relationship with the European Union and negotiations for an EU-New Zealand free trade agreement. Now, we see that as complementary to, rather than competing with, a post-Brexit free trade agreement between the UK and New Zealand. And in fact, I met EU Agriculture Commissioner Phil Hogan when he was visiting here last week, and he said that the EU was aiming for its fastest ever FTA negotiation with New Zealand. Secondly, there's the opportunity and indeed the imperative to work together on the global stage. Now, we're delighted that this government in New Zealand has put climate change at the heart of its foreign policy, and it's looking to the UK model for its domestic legislation. We need to work together to tackle this existential threat, and also to protect the taonga of our wildlife and natural resources. We want to work alongside New Zealand and the Pacific in upholding the rules-based international order, in tackling the threat of terrorism and hostile states, and championing free trade. And in the Pacific, it's worth noting that in December, we co-hosted with New Zealand a conference on climate change in the Pacific, gathering Pacific leaders after COP to look both at how we tackle climate change, but also how you respond and mitigate. Then earlier this year, earlier in January, we had HMS Montrose, a Royal Navy warship, visit Auckland. And I think that was the first ship's visit to Auckland in almost 20 years. And that was, I think, a real tangible demonstration of the UK's commitment to the Asia-Pacific region, to security in this region, and to working in partnership with New Zealand to shore up that security. Thirdly, bilaterally, we want to continue to build on the strong links between our countries, and we want to future-proof those links. And when Prime Minister Ardern met Prime Minister May in London in January, and I was there at the lunch, and I think, quite frankly, it was the highlight of our Prime Minister's Day, they agreed that we share a desire to forge an ambitious, high-quality free trade agreement after we leave the EU. Now, your Prime Minister talks about a gold standard FTA, and I think that ambition is shared. And that free trade agreement is, of course, yes, it's about the economic benefits to our countries, but it's much more than that. It will demonstrate what 2 like-minded countries can do in a trade agreement, focusing not just on the bottom line, but on how to progress broader objectives on the environment, gender, and inequality. And for the UK, it will be a high-quality, high-ambition FTA that really sets the tone for our future trade policy. And beyond trade, there are a whole host of areas where we cooperate, but which often go under the radar. On data analytics for social investment, on cyber, on agri-tech, the list goes on. And this year, as we approach 250 years since the first encounters between Captain James Cook and the Maori of Aotearoa, New Zealand, I am committed to delivering a step change in the UK's engagement with Māoridom and iwi, and we've just recruited a Māori engagement advisor to that end. So, to conclude, and Marion's not trying to wrap me up too quickly, but I am coming to the end. We live in very interesting times. British politics are certainly more interesting than they've ever been before in my lifetime. And there are some people who are perhaps nostalgic for the days when things were a bit more boring. But we are going through momentous change, and it will continue to be bumpy, and it will continue to be noisy as negotiations reach their end point. But while getting the right Brexit arrangement is a major preoccupation, and rightly so, we shouldn't let it obscure how much else is going on in the world and the role that the UK can play, together with partners like New Zealand, in tackling shared threats, protecting and pursuing common goods, and bit by bit, making the world a better place. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.